And when he did, he saw to his surprise and joy that Snow White's eyes fluttered open.
Story Bugs!
Hello and welcome to Storytime. Thank you for joining me for the last chapter of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, adapted by the film from the film by Jim Rossi and illustrated by Fernando Guel and Fred Marvin. This is the last chapter of Snow White, and we just left the witch fell off the rocks, and then the dwarves came home to see Snow White on the floor. So let's see what happens. Chapter 14. The dwarves could not bear to bury the princess, so they fashioned a coffin of gold and glass and placed Snow White in it. Then they carried the coffin to a peaceful glen in the woods. Every day, the dwarves kept vigil at the coffin and placed flowers around it. One day, the following spring, the dwarves were keeping their usual vigil. They had opened the glass top and placed a bouquet of flowers in Snow White's hands. Then they knelt before the coffin and bowed their heads. They were surprised to see a handsome prince ride into the clearing on a white horse. He was the very same young man who had first met Snow White at the well. He had heard of the beautiful maiden who slept in the glass coffin and was curious to see if it was the same princess he had once met. As he approached the coffin, the prince realized that it was the same girl. Sadly, he knelt by the coffin and bowed his head. Then he bent over the still form and gave Snow White one farewell kiss. And when he did, he saw to his surprise and joy that Snow White's eyes fluttered open. She was alive. Snow White slowly sat up and smiled. It was as if she had just woken up from a good night's sleep. When she saw the prince, her eyes lit up in surprise, and she held out her arms to him. The prince quickly took her in his arms and lifted her up. For a moment, the dwarves stood silent and unbelieving. But they soon threw their hats in the air and yelled and cheered in delight. When they had finally calmed down again, Snow White went over and looked at each one of them fondly. "You have been good, kind friends," she said in a soft voice, "and I shall never forget you." One by one, the dwarves stood by while Snow White kissed each one of them on the forehead. "Goodbye, princess," they called, as the prince lifted Snow White onto his horse. "Goodbye," she called back. Then the prince took the reins of his steed and slowly led it away. "Goodbye," Snow White called out once more, as she and the prince slowly disappeared from view. When Snow White and the prince had gone, the dwarves looked at each other and smiled. Even though they would miss her, they knew Snow White's wish had finally come true. She had found her true love, and she would live happily ever after. And that made them happy too, even Grumpy. The end. Thank you guys for traveling through that story with me, and I'm so happy that at the end she gets to have something joyful and exciting. Thank you guys for joining me, and I hope you'll come back for another story sometime soon. If you guys enjoyed reading that story, would you please click subscribe down below? We read new stories just like this one every day, and we would love to let you know when there's a new story to listen to.